Here the death row prisoner lives in a cell 4 feet by 10 feet, but only after a strip search, in handcuffs, and watched constantly by armed patrol.
Death row, it's a lot of cell time, dark, kind of parasitic, the environment, and they make up their own rules and changes day to day, and you never know really what's coming, and it's just oppressive.
We have to strip down naked, show ourselves, and then get handcuffed to go anywhere.
Jasper, Texas. June 6th, 1998. It's a warm Saturday night in a small East Texas town. James Byrd Jr. had spent the evening with family. He was 49 years old, a father, a man who had lived in Jasper most of his life. And when the night wound down, he decided to walk home. It wasn't an unusual decision. He knew these roads. He'd walked them before. At some point along the way, a gray pickup truck slowed down beside him. He looked through the window. He recognized one of the men inside, and he got in. That was the last decision James Byrd Jr. ever made freely. By the following morning, he was gone. And what had been done to him on that rural Texas road would become one of the most disturbing hate crimes in modern American history. But this story doesn't begin that night. It begins much earlier, with the men in that truck, and with what they had already become, long before James Byrd Jr. ever stepped inside. To understand what happened on that road, you first have to understand what was sitting in that truck beside him. The driver was Sean Barry. Barry was local. He'd grown up in Jasper. He and Bill King had been friends since high school. Of the three men, Barry was the one James Byrd likely felt at ease with, the familiar face that made getting into that truck feel safe. The second man was Lawrence Russell Brewer. Brewer had been in and out of the Texas prison system since 1987. By the time he ended up in Jasper in 1998, he wasn't passing through. He had moved into Bill King's apartment just weeks before this night. Two men, same ideology, same address, and based on the evidence, the same plan. And then there was Bill King. King was the one investigators kept coming back to. The one the evidence pointed to as the ringleader. The one whose writings, whose tattoos, whose own words after the fact, all told the same story. But here is what makes King different from the others. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't someone who drifted into Jasper from somewhere else. Bill King was from Jasper, born there, raised there. He grew up in the same town as James Byrd Jr., walked the same streets, lived in the same community, in a town of roughly 8,000 people. There is every chance their paths had crossed before that night. And yet, on June 6th, 1998, King did not see a neighbor in that man. So the question isn't just what Bill King did. The question is, how did he get there? How does someone grow up in a community alongside the very people he would later target and arrive at a place like that? The answer starts inside a Texas prison cell. But before we get there, I want to ask you something. Do you think the prison system bears any responsibility for who people become while they're inside? Because that question sits at the center of everything that comes next. Leave your answer in the comments below. In 1995, Bill King was 20 years old. He'd been convicted of burglary, nothing that suggested what was coming. Just a young man from a small town who had made some bad choices and was now going to prison for them. What happened to him inside that facility is disputed in its details. But what emerged on the other side of those prison walls was not the same person who went in. According to accounts that surfaced during the investigation and trial, King alleged that he was gang raped multiple times by black inmates while incarcerated. That allegation was never formally proven, but it was offered by those close to him as the moment something broke. His father, Ronald King, struggled to make sense of what his son had become. He went to a priest, Reverend Ron Fauchage, and said something that's hard to forget. Something happened to my boy in prison. Something bad. He never had this kind of hate in his heart. Now, whether that trauma was real, exaggerated, or used as justification after the fact, we can't say with certainty. What we can say is this: Bill King entered that prison without a known history of racism, and he left it as a committed white supremacist. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because prison, particularly in the Texas system of that era, was fertile ground for extremist recruitment. White supremacist gangs operated openly behind those walls, and they understood exactly how to bring someone in. They didn't lead with hate. They led with protection, with belonging, with brotherhood. When a young man is vulnerable, isolated, and afraid, and someone offers him a group, an identity, and a reason for his pain, that offer is very hard to refuse. King didn't just join a group. He joined the Confederate Knights of America, a white supremacist prison gang. And he didn't stay at the bottom. He rose through the ranks until he held a leadership position with the title Exalted Cyclops. It was inside that same system that he met Lawrence Russell Brewer, two men, shaped by the same ideology, feeding each other's beliefs. By the time both of them were out, they weren't just acquaintances. They were aligned. You could read King's radicalization on his body, his torso, his arms, covered in tattoos acquired during and after his time in prison. A swastika, KKK emblems, a depiction of a black man hanging from a tree. The words Aryan Pride, the insignia of the Confederate Knights of America. Each tattoo wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration. A record of how far he had traveled from the unremarkable kid that Captain Carter of the Jasper Sheriff's Office once described as being like one of his own sons. And it wasn't just the tattoos. Investigators searching King's apartment after the murder found a copy of a book called The Turner Diaries. If you're not familiar with it, it's a novel published in 1978 that depicts a violent white supremacist revolution. It has been linked to multiple domestic terror attacks in the United States, including the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. It is, in essence, a blueprint for racial violence dressed up as fiction. King didn't just own it. According to testimony, he referenced it after the beating of James Byrd Jr. By the time King walked out of prison and back into Jasper, the transformation was complete. And shortly after his release, Lawrence Russell Brewer moved into his apartment. Weeks later, James Byrd Jr. accepted a ride, and then came the night they decided to act. Instead of taking James Byrd home, they drove him in the opposite direction, out of town, down a rural road, to an isolated wooded area where there were no witnesses and no lights. What happened there was a beating, a severe one, with a baseball bat. They urinated on him, and then they chained him by his ankles to the back of the pickup truck. The truck engine started. For the next 3 miles, James Byrd Jr. was dragged along an asphalt road. Investigators later determined that he remained conscious for much of it. He tried to keep his head up. The road took everything else. His body struck a culvert on the side of the road. That was the moment he died. His torso was left near a black church and cemetery. The rest of his remains were scattered across nearly 3 miles of road. In the aftermath, King reportedly spoke about what they had done with something close to pride. He believed it would make history. He believed it would help expand their white supremacist network, attract attention, attract followers. He was right that it made history, just not in the way he intended. We're just past the halfway point, and we still have the trial, a jailhouse letter written in King's own hand that prosecutors used to bury him, and a Supreme Court battle that came within 1 vote of keeping him alive. If this kind of storytelling is what you're here for, hit subscribe. I cover cases like this every week. Now let's get into the evidence. while King and Brewer were both in custody awaiting trial. King wrote Brewer a letter. He didn't know investigators would intercept it. In that letter, King wrote, "Regardless of the outcome of this, we have made history. Death before dishonor. Sieg Heil." That last phrase, a Nazi salute, written casually, as a sign-off. That letter didn't just confirm what investigators already suspected. It removed any remaining doubt about motive, about intent, and about King's state of mind. And that wasn't the only piece of evidence working against him. An investigating officer testified that after the beating, King referenced the Turner Diaries, the same book found in his apartment, the same manifesto that glorified exactly the kind of violence that had just been committed. King would later claim he wasn't present for the dragging, that he had been dropped off at his apartment before it happened. That Berry and Brewer acted without him, but physical evidence and witness testimony told a different story, and the letter, in his own handwriting, told the clearest story of all. King, Brewer, and Berry were each tried separately in 1999. King's trial began in February of that year in Jasper County. And from the very start, it did not go the way he wanted. His court-appointed lawyers made a decision. Faced with the weight of evidence against their client, they chose to concede his guilt during the trial, not to argue innocence, but to focus entirely on keeping him off death row, to present mitigating factors. His prison experiences, his radicalization, anything that might move the jury away from a death sentence. King did not agree to this strategy. He explicitly told them not to do it. He wanted to argue innocence. He believed he could beat the charges. And when his lawyers proceeded anyway, he tried to fire them. He wrote letters to the court. He wrote letters to the media. He was clear on the record that his own legal team was acting against his wishes. The court did not remove his lawyers. On February 25, 1999, the jury convicted Bill King of capital murder. Deliberation took 2.5 hours. The following day, they sentenced him to death by lethal injection. But here's something I want you to think about. King's lawyers admitted his guilt in open court, without his permission, to try to save his life. Do you think that was a betrayal of their client? Or was it the right legal call given the evidence? Let me know what you think in the comments. Bill King arrived on death row in 1999, and for the next 20 years, his position never changed. He did not do it. He was not there for the dragging. He had been dropped off before it happened. Berry and Brewer were responsible, not him. That was his claim in 1999. It was still his claim in 2019. Most people had long stopped listening. The evidence, the letter, the testimony, all of it pointed in one direction. But in 2018, something happened in a courtroom that had nothing to do with Bill King. And suddenly his lawyers had a new argument. The case was McCoy versus Louisiana. A different defendant, a different state. But the legal question at the center of it was one that King's team had been waiting for. The Supreme Court ruled that a defendant has the constitutional right to decide whether to admit guilt at trial, not their lawyer, the defendant. And if a lawyer overrides that decision, even with good intentions, it is a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. King's lawyers had done exactly that in 1999. They had conceded his guilt without his consent. He had objected on the record. He had tried to fire them, and none of it had mattered at the time. Now, 20 years later, it might. His team filed emergency appeals. They asked the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals for a stay of execution to allow the courts to properly examine whether McCoy applied to King's case and whether it applied retroactively to convictions from before the ruling. On April 22, 2019, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals voted 5-4. The stay was denied. The appeal went to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied it, without comment. No explanation, no opinion, just denied. The Board of Pardons and Paroles rejected the final appeal shortly after. Every door had closed. 2 days later, it was over. Texas State Penitentiary, Huntsville, Texas. Bill King was 44 years old. At 7:08 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Before the lethal injection was administered, the warden asked him if he had any last words. King said one word, "No." He closed his eyes. And he said nothing else. No statement, no apology, no final claim of innocence spoken aloud. Just silence. The Byrd family was not in that room. They had chosen not to attend. Some of them spoke afterward about complicated feelings. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but something quieter than either of those things. James Byrd's sister, Lou Von Harris, had said something during the trial years earlier that stayed with people. There were no winners in this. We felt their pain as well. That line about feeling the pain of the family of the man who killed her brother says more about who James Byrd Jr.'s family was than anything else in this story. And there is one final detail worth knowing. King's body was returned to Jasper for burial. The plot sits roughly 100 yards from the grave of James Byrd Jr. In the end, they came back to the same town, the same ground, the same place it all began. James Byrd Jr. was murdered in June of 1998. 3 years later, in 2001, Texas passed the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act, legislation that enhanced penalties for crimes motivated by race, religion, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. 8 years after that, in 2009, President Obama signed the federal Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law, expanding federal authority to prosecute hate crimes across the country. 2 laws, both carrying his name. The case also became one of the most studied examples in America of what prison radicalization looks like, how it starts, how it spreads, and what it produces when it walks back out into the world. And that is the question this case has never fully answered. If the environment inside that prison helped shape Bill King into what he became, then what is still happening inside those walls today? And who is walking out? That's not a rhetorical question. It's an open one. Here is where each of the 4 men in this story ended up. James Byrd Jr. was 49 years old. He wanted a ride home. He didn't make it. Lawrence Russell Brewer was executed on September 21st, 2011, the first of the 3 to be put to death. Bill King was executed on April 24th, 2019. He never admitted he was there. Sean Berry is in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until 2038. And James Byrd Jr., the man who just wanted to get home that night. His name is now written into federal law. That's the least this story could give him. If this case meant something to you, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and I cover them every week. The next one is already coming. Remember his name.